Hello, this is Tony Nichols, co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Great Ideas. And on this video on our enterprise architecture with examples using Microsoft.NET Blazor, Azure, Great Ideas, Trellispark, we're going to be doing a quick introduction to business architecture within the scope of enterprise architecture. So although over the course of my career my primary focus has been application development, I've also needed to consider the following questions. So why do we even need IT in the first place? And then once we've established the need for IT, then understanding how an enterprise would add value through its operations, and then making sure that we align and optimize those operations across the organization and within the IT support framework. As part of that activity, we also need to consider identifying opportunities for improving operations and identifying and prioritizing requirements to make sure that those changes become apparent inside the IT organization. And once we've got a set of requirements, we also need to understand how to translate those requirements into a solution, and then we need to validate that the solution actually meets the requirements we gave it in the first place. One last section that we will consider as part of business architecture is why the IT industry as a whole has adopted agile practices and what that means from the context of business architecture. As we go through the course, we will be doing a set of deep dive videos on many of these topics. So let's try and answer the first question. Why do we even need IT in the first place? So if you look at a lot of archaeology and you look at some of the examples of the first writing and in civilizations across the world, you find that many of the examples on baked clay tablets, whether it's in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, or whether you're looking at Kipu from Mesoamerica, a lot of what we actually have that was written down, if you like, were inventories. How many bottles of wine, how many, jugs of fig juice, how many ingots of gold, how many, copper swords, whatever. So a lot of what we're actually seeing in terms of examples of writing were effectively operational information relating to running businesses, inventories, accounts, orders, invoices, and so on. So, right the way back in the dawn of civilization, as soon as you had merchants, as soon as you had people, who were actually providing services to other people, you started to see a need for writing, a need for stored information. And today, most, if not all, organizations run on some form of stored information or data. Now, more recently, right, and by recently, I'm talking about the last few decades, so from the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, 2010s, and now in the 2020s, more differentiation has been led through businesses via automation and analytics of stored data. So, for example, if we're processing a credit card transaction today, most of us are just tapping our credit cards on a machine. That machine is initiating an electronic check to see whether or not the account is valid, whether it has any money in it, whether you've exceeded any quotas or anything. It's doing a check to do risk analysis to see whether this is likely to be a fraudulent transaction, and then it's reporting a success fail back to the merchant. So you sort of think about what's going on there, right? You've got a whole bunch of automation and streamlined processes happening, and then detailed analytics of that information and transaction, to add value to the process as a whole. So what we're seeing is that more recently, over the past few decades, automation and analytics of this stored data has become a differentiator for those organizations which are now being successful in the modern world. And that will continue to accelerate. So what we're seeing here is that the bottom line is that any organization that's storing and processing data needs some form of IT to actually make that work, and that IT becomes the differentiator for that business process and the thing that helps that organization to be successful. If you had a business that didn't have any need to store and process information, that business would not need IT. Okay, so one of the key things here is most, if not all, businesses need to store and process information. So most businesses need some form of IT support to actually provide that capability. So this whole topic then is about IT's ability to support the business. And when you think about it, it comes into these 6 bullets that I've identified here. Okay, so first and foremost, okay, a good IT system would give the operations people, managers, executives, visibility into the operational data. How many cases have I got open? How many orders are unfulfilled? How many invoices have been paid? I need to understand the operational data that underlies my business. Okay, so from an executive, from a management perspective, I need to be able to see that data so that I can understand what my business needs to respond to today. What are my challenges? What do I need to do? Do I need to staff more people? Do I need to build more of product A or more of product B? And ideally, what my IT system should be doing is then helping me to improve and maintain the quality of that information. Because the better visibility and the better quality of the information that I'm looking at, the better decisions I can make, both as a senior executive, right the way to a frontline employee trying to service a customer request or trying to solve a case for a client. And the other thing we should be looking to our IT systems to do is helping us to streamline operations. It should be more efficient to be able to use this information that we've been given as part of an automated process. It should help us to work through and work with our customers and clients and members and whoever we're working with to actually achieve the tasks and deliver the results of the organization. And ideally, that goes further now into analytics, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to actually analyze the data we've got to do more predictive analytics to understand, well, how many people am I going to need next week, right? How many of these products need to be in inventory and so on. And again, we also want IT to be able to give us a rapid response. So when something in the business changes, so for example, we had this whole thing with COVID in the last couple of years, right? We need to be able to respond rapidly as a business to changes in the environment, in changes in regulatory governance, in changes in just in how the marketplace is working and how people are buying goods and servicing things. The other thing that the IT needs to really help us with is things like mergers and acquisitions on a large scale. So when company A buys company B, with the objective of saying, hey, look, if I take the applications from A and B and bring these two companies together, I can consolidate the operations and streamline the processes, and that will make things a lot more efficient. Okay, a lot of that underlying efficiency comes from the merger of the actual applications that underlie those in business processes. So again, one of the things that we want to be able to do with mergers and acquisitions is to be able to freely integrate and separate applications as the needs of the business change over time. And another key thing that IT should be doing for us is it should be helping us through innovation to drive the creation of new differentiated products and services and goods to help us build the value and market share of the organization that we're working with. So IT changes so quickly. The introduction of smartphones, new versions of smartphones, new technologies, new ways of doing things, new ways of analyzing data. The information revolution over the last 5-10 years is just accelerating, and that should be driving not just IT, but it also should be driving operational efficiencies in the enterprise as well. Now, you would have thought that these are so fundamental, so motherhood and apple pie, that this should be 5 immediate check marks. Visibility, improve, streamline, rapid response, and innovation. Those should be at the heart of business and IT. Those should be big green check marks. Everybody should be doing this. Everybody should be doing this really, really well. Okay. And the sad truth is, 40 years in this business, I've been looking at many organizations, hundreds of projects. This isn't true. These aren't 5 green check marks. And what we're seeing is that most organizations still have tens and sometimes even hundreds of applications where data is siloed. So I might have, say, 10 different applications dealing with customers, all of which have a different understanding of who the customers are, the data we're going to store, and actually trying to get a view into that operational data that is consistent and complete is a fundamental challenge. So that fact that we have these application silos limits our visibility in operational data. And we're going to be talking in detail around how do we break down these operational silos. Improving and maintaining the quality of data, a fundamental requirement of IT systems. Yet when you think about it, how many times when you look at a business process does a user have to log into application A, enter some information to begin a task, then swivel to application B, sign in again, re-input some of the information from A and some new information to actually get to the next step of the task, then do the same in application C and the same in application D and E. The number of times we've been in organizations where we've looked at a task and it spans 5 to 10 different applications to complete, placing an order and initiating fulfillment, where we have a rekey of information. It happens all the time. There are very few organizations where that is not actually happening. And because we're rekeying that information, we've got at every point where the information is rekeyed, the issue of data quality is did they spell the name the same correctly in both locations? Did they put the same address in both locations? So the more times we have to swivel between applications, the more opportunities there are to actually introduce errors into the data, which reduces the quality of that information. But streamlining operations. You can only really streamline the operations if you've actually integrated the data. So if you've got, say, 10 different customer applications and you're trying to automate a process across all of those applications, if the data is not freely available for integration, then you have an issue with basically automating a workflow, and you're back to the user manually signing into A to do this, then B, then C, and so on. Okay, so if you've got all these application data silos, it becomes a problem streamlining operations across those applications. The other thing is that these IT systems were never cheap in the first place. So you might spend millions of dollars building your customer solution to do a particular job and then integrating that into other operational systems for fulfillment and financing and so on. and you spent millions of dollars and you spent years doing it, and that system's now going to be running for the next 10 years, 20 years. And I've seen insurance applications 40 years old. So these applications are there, okay, and they're not quick and easy to change. These are big monolithic things that are basically anchoring you to the past. And if you want to make changes in those applications, that can be a risky, expensive, time-consuming process. So again, one of the issues that we see in real world is that these applications are basically acting as an anchor to the past. They're actually meaning that you can't easily introduce new customer types, new product types, new innovations in the organization. And then the other sort of side of that, the other facet of that is the issue that you have with merger and acquisition. So, for example, if I have company X and company Y and I want to bring these two companies together, part of the rationale for that is that by bringing X and Y together, I can streamline the operations over this process. Well, when you have these big monolithic applications, sometimes that can become very difficult to do. And I've seen a lot of organizations where they've gone through merger and acquisition of several different companies, and you can still look at the IT department a decade later and see the individual applications that came from each company, because a decade later, they still haven't been merged. So you've then got to question, well, really, did they actually achieve the operational benefits of the merger and acquisition, because they failed to even merge the underlying IT systems? The thing with IT is supposed to support the business, but the question that you really have to ask when you go into a lot of these businesses is how efficiently is it really doing that? And are there opportunities to improve? So the final bullet on this page, to successfully support the business, IT must first understand the business, is where we're going to lead into with a lot of the challenges that we'll be covering under the business architecture section of this course. And ideally what we want to try and achieve is we want to make the visibility, quality, streamlining, rapid response, and IT innovation all big green check marks. But the first step of achieving that is to make sure that IT actually understands the business, and even more importantly, that the business understands itself. So we need to understand how an enterprise adds value through its own operation. And you would have thought this would have been really easy. And the answer is no, it isn't. Okay. So in reality, again, if we go into a moderately sized organization and we talk to executives across different business units or different functions within the organization about how the business adds its value, then we're faced with a bunch of challenges right out the door. What we find in reality is that very, very few organizations actually have any up-to-date business documentation at all. So if you go in and ask them what their value chains are, if you go in and ask them what their business processes are or how they operate, very few organizations can give you a document that says, here is how we operate, and everybody in the organization agrees on it, right? That just doesn't happen in practice, or well, certainly, in 40 years of practice, I've not seen it very often. Also, very few organizations regularly go through a streamlining of operations. So they'll put something in place, and maybe back in 2010, and then nobody's really officially formally looking at it in 2011, 2012, 2013. Maybe when it's time to redo the application in 2020, somebody comes along and has a look and says, well, okay, here's what everybody has been complaining about for the last 10 years. Let's try and incorporate that into the next release of the application. Okay, so regular streamlining, optimization, continuous improvement tends to be something that's discussed in ivory towers, but it's not actually implemented in practice. And the other thing we find is that organizations do tend to be locked into their existing solutions for the reasons that we talked about on the previous slide, right? These solutions might have been multi-million-dollar 3-year builds, and they've got a lifetime locked in decades. It's very hard to change processes and streamline operations because it's expensive to change the applications. The other side of this is the people side, right? Is that people will tend to focus on what drives their paycheck, right? So if you have basically a person who has got a whole bunch of key performance indicators that implement how they get paid or how they get their bonuses, right? They are going to focus on hitting those KPIs. That's not necessarily the most focused way of actually hitting the value for the organization as a whole. Okay, so one thing that you have to remember when you're looking at how businesses and operations are adding value is how do you incentivize people to add value to the organization rather than just to add value to themselves. Okay, now everybody is trying to minimize their own workload, right? Nobody's going looking for work. I want to work harder, right, for less money. Okay, people generally don't do that. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to find ways to make their jobs easier, which in some respects is good, right? Because if their job becomes easier, then maybe they can do more, more cases, more sales, more whatever, because it's now easier to do that, right? But what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that that behavior is recognized and rewarded and supported by IT. Now, again, what we find in practice when we go through a lot of organizations is that there is a rise of what we call shadow or feral IT. So this is the use of informal IT to achieve a business objective. So there are many organizations where we've been in over the last 40 odd years, where we've gone in to do some analysis to look at how the IT systems are being used and how they could be improved. And what we've found is that most of the actual operations are done on spreadsheets and access databases outside of the actual formal IT systems. So that's a problem, right? Because now you've got a set of data that's being used for a bunch of manual processes that are all being taken offline, right, and into little Excel spreadsheets, into little access databases or whatever, and aren't part of the formal IT process. So they may not be being backed up. They may not be being part of the actual visibility that the management is seeing into the application. Or conversely, they might be exactly what the management is looking at, but not representing what's currently in the databases. So when we go into an organization and we see that, look, you know what, if all of the organizational reporting is done on a spreadsheet, and to produce that spreadsheet takes a month, because what they do is they do an ETL from the database, they copy that into the spreadsheet, they then massage it and map it across information from other spreadsheets, from other applications to actually produce a final report. Then you really have to ask the question, what are the executive actually looking at? Is that a real representation of the state of the business at any particular point in time? Right now, ideally, we want our executive looking at information that's correct and complete up to the minute, and the quality of that information is good. But the more we're depending on the shadow and feral IT, the less visibility the operational management actually has in what the true state of the underlying data is. So this all basically leads to this thing of suboptimal operations, right? If we've reduced the quality of the data, if we've reduced the productivity of the application because we have not, as an organization, been involved in continuous improvement and streamlining of the processes, and they're supporting IT infrastructure and solutions, then that can only mean that our business is incurring additional costs and risks beyond what's absolutely necessary. And that obviously impacts the bottom line of the business, it impacts the profitability, it impacts the customer satisfaction, and it has negative impacts across everything. So one thing that we want to really understand here is, how do we actually move away from this? How do we get to a point where the business understands itself, can communicate to IT, and then IT can actually implement those changes to make sure that it's constantly updating its solutions to meet the changing needs of business. So one of the first phases that we need to go through as we work through business architecture is make sure that we align and optimize operations across both the business and the IT groups that are actually going to implement those requirements. So the first thing that we tend to do is go through high-level consensus building to make sure that we understand how business is operating and how value is being added as those operations progress. And we want to do that initially with the business, because it's amazing how many times you'll conduct a workshop where you bring in business executives from different operational units or different functional areas, and you say, well, okay, what is it you do across the business, across the different function, and how are we streamlining that value flow across the organization? And so many times you'll go into a meeting like this where business leaders from different business units will say, well, I didn't know you did that. But if we did this, then we could reduce the cost of this, or we could increase the value of this, or we could increase the productivity there. And just that 2-hour workshop where we're doing a value chain analysis can lead to a whole bunch of new requirements and new ways of thinking that generate opportunities that enable us to streamline the business. A more detailed step process that we would go through is something called business process analysis and optimization. So this is typically around a detailed function within an organization. So you may have a value chain that has maybe 10 or 20 or 100 different business processes operating within it. So a value chain is a high level flow of functionality, and the business process is more the operational or tactical delivery of a particular function. And we'll have a couple of slides about each of these in a minute. Once you've achieved the high-level consensus on how we're adding value, then we need to make sure that we have a governance framework. So the governance framework is essentially going to be a whole different section, right? We're going to do a whole bunch of different videos that talk about governance in general. But the main thing that I want you to take away from this video is that the governance framework ties in tightly to the business architecture, because the whole point of the business architecture is to provide a common understanding of what the business needs, what the requirements are, and then identify to the governance team what are the opportunities and risks in the current situation that we need to address, and then help the business to understand how to prioritize those requirements for implementation. So that is a whole section in and of itself, but it is a key element that comes out of the fact that you have a business architecture. If you don't have a business architecture, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to implement a useful governance framework. And then the whole thing around this is document it, rinse it, repeat it, right? You've got to keep doing it. It's not a one-off shot that you do the business architecture and then you can forget about it for 10 years, right? You ideally want to do the business architecture and then review aspects of that architecture on a regular basis. You should be constantly looking for new opportunities, new requirements, eliminating or mitigating new risks. And the thing to bear in mind is that this rate of change is constantly accelerating. And a lot of that acceleration is being driven by changes in our underlying information architecture and technology. So that the more rapidly our IT architecture and abilities mature and are deployed, the more we can provide for innovation within the rest of the operations. And that innovation drives operational changes to provide better operational performance. So one of the key things to bear in mind when we're talking about enterprise architecture is that a good enterprise architecture isn't just optimizing the costs and risks of the IT, it's optimizing the costs and risks of the organization as a whole, all of its operations, not just the IT operation. Okay, so a great technique for aligning understanding at the higher levels of the executive is to go through a process of value chain analysis. Now, unfortunately, there is no well-defined standard for value chain analysis, but essentially what we're looking for here is a sequenced set of links. So when you go through a value chain analysis, and we'll do a whole tutorial on how do you workshop value chain analysis as a separate video, essentially what you're trying to do is draw a high-level set of links that span the entire business. So any business unit can be involved in this. Any functional area of the business can be involved in this. And what we're trying to do is understand the key links in a chain. Now, when we're looking at those links, what we're trying to do is get a sense of the chain as a whole as it impacts all of the business units and functional areas, but we're looking for opportunities to improve the value addition across everything. We're looking at the people, the processes, the applications, the underlying infrastructure and technology. So the idea when we're doing value chain analysis is not only are we getting consensus on how value is being added through operations, we're also looking for high-level opportunities for ways of streamlining that value chain, for ways of producing a higher quality product, reducing the cost of producing that product, reducing the risks of producing that product. Now, in practice, most organizations have relatively few core value chains, maybe of the order of 5 to 10 core value chains that are really driving the differentiated value of that specific business. In addition to those core value chains, then there are many what we describe as support value chains. So, for example, most organizations will have some sort of human resources function. There'd be value chains for bringing new employees into the organization. There might be a value chain for terminating an employee from the organization. So there are a lot of support value chains that are relatively common, and this is generally exploited by SaaS organizations, right? So if I'm building a SaaS version of an HR or a CRM application, I'm banking on the fact that most of these support value chains are relatively common with organizations. But the thing that really differentiates any specific business, there's probably 5 to 10 key value chains that need to be explored. And those are the things that differentiate that business and the value. And again, we will do a complete video presentation around how to do value chain analysis effectively, the sorts of things that you want to look for in the links, the sort of mechanisms that you want to do to actually go through this process. So a step below value chain analysis essentially is the business process analysis and optimization. And again, there is no real standard for this, right? It depends on which tool you use, which process you look at. But essentially, what we're looking at when we're doing a business process analysis is we're looking at the different roles that are participating in a particular business analysis. A business process is going to be a subset. So within an overall value chain, a value chain might encompass 10, 20, 50, 100 different business processes. And then the business processes are basically discussing how does the business users and the people who are interacting with the business actually go through the process of these steps. So in this particular example, for example, we're looking at a swim lane diagram where we have people who are designated as employees, supervisors, and administrators, and then you can see the steps they're going through. So typically these process charts are swim lane diagrams where each lane responds to a user role, and then we have essentially a flow chart embedded in that swim lane diagram that shows you the flow of processing associated with essentially the happy path of the process. When I say happy path, is assuming that everything goes right at a high level. This is how the process flows. What it doesn't cover is all of the detailed errors, exception handling, and everything else. So this is still a high level description of what a business process is, where the decisions are being made, the sorts of artifacts that are going to be produced, the sort of information actually required. So this is a high level analytical process. And again, we'll be doing a separate deep dive video on business process analysis, optimization, identifying opportunities, and so on. So the whole point of our value chain analysis, business process analysis, is to generate a set of requirements. So these requirements will come out of opportunities. There will be identified risks that need to be mitigated. There might be issues with the existing system, but essentially what we will end up is a bunch of requirements. And one of the things that the governance team always asks us for is, well, how do I evaluate and prioritize these requirements that you've given me? And one thing they always seem to want to do is this idea of a return on investment. And to be truthful, the ROI calculations are much more of an art than a science. If you're in a massive organization and you have a ton of statistical data behind you and some really good analytics, then you know what, they can probably do the math impartially and say, well, I've got option A and option B and option C, and option A has an ROI of 5.3, and option B has an ROI of 5.6, and option C has an ROI of 4.8. So we'll go with option B, please, right? And if you're in a massive organization with a ton of data and the time to do it, great, right? Because you need that level of rigor to choose the right elements of the process. But most SMEs are not there. They don't have the data, they don't have the analytics. Sometimes the benefits can be really hard to evaluate and put into a number. And then costs, again, estimating the costs can be an art form in terms of, well, how long is it going to take to implement the change? What technology are we going to need? How long is it going to take to do? What's it going to cost to do it? So the issue is that by the time you've got these benefits and costs for most organizations that don't really have the capability or data to support them, your estimated versus actual ROIs can be off by orders of magnitude, right? So it's very difficult to do an ROI on 3 options and then say with definitive accuracy, A is the best option. I mean, sometimes it's obvious and it's the only option, but choosing and doing an ROI and saying this is the basis of why I chose option A over option B, it can be a bit tricky. And the truth really is figure out what works for you. And it's somewhere between the emotional gut feel and some analysis, some level of analysis, but don't assume that you're going to get a detailed answer or that's actually going to be accurate when you actually get to the point where you've implemented it, because the estimated values you get may have no comparison to the actual values you see in real production. So one way of achieving this and actually making better decisions here is that we need to make sure that we don't have complex requirements. So whenever we get something that's a complex requirement, we want to break it down into smaller tasks. And ideally, we want to be able to break it down into smaller tasks that we can implement separately, incrementally. And each of those tasks, as we implement it separately, will deliver some level of value to the organization as well. So essentially, if you've got a really big thing that you're looking at maybe months worth of work and tens of thousands of dollars worth of thing, is can you break that down into a set of smaller tasks that will deliver value faster? And each of those incremental steps builds towards the final answer. And then once you've got those smaller tasks, then it generally becomes obvious what sequence do we need to do these tasks in, what's the priority, and how are they adding value, and then we can monitor that as we go through that process. So again, this is part of governance, but it's also important to understand from a business perspective, because we need to understand the business implications of taking our requirements and detailing them down into a set of smaller scale requirements so we can pass on to the governance team and the IT teams for actual execution. So now we get the fun thing, right? We've got a set of requirements that we're giving to our IT team, and we need to make sure that the IT team actually understands the business requirements. So it was fun just getting the business to reach a common understanding of what the IT requirements are. Now we've got to get the IT team to do it as well, right? Now, one of the analogies I always have is, let's say, for example, you've got a business that speaks English talking to a business analyst who only speaks German, who's talking to a designer that speaks French, who's giving it to a bunch of developers that speak Chinese, and your testing team only speaks Indian. You don't even have a common language. How are you going to make sure that what your business actually wanted has been actually correctly understood at all of the different levels and disciplines into getting to a solution that you're validating? And essentially all of these experts that you have, from BAs to architects, designers, to coders, to testers, are all professionals in their own right. They all have their own skills. They all have their own languages that they're talking, right? I mean, I'm not talking sort of like English, French, German, whatever. Okay, just the techniques, the ideas, the way they were trained, what they're thinking about, the assumptions that they're making are all different. So trying to get everybody to speak and understand a common language from the point where the requirement has been specified to the point where the requirement has been validated and delivered into the business can itself be a challenge. So one thing that we need to make sure that we're doing right the way through this process is making sure that everybody's on the same page. And again, this is one of the strengths of the Agile approach, is that we've produced a DevOps team that basically brings these people together to share that common understanding. And an appropriate thing that needs to be happening as we bring that team together is that we need to make sure that we are eliminating any assumptions that that team might be doing. Okay, so if one person is assuming one thing and another person is assuming diametrically the opposite, but they're not aware that they're making the assumption, then the implementation at some point will be flawed. So one thing that we need to do when we bring this DevOps team together and we get them communicating with a common language is we need to make sure that we're also identifying and eliminating any assumptions that were being made within the different members of that team. Now, the other thing that's really important to do is make sure that when we're specifying requirements to that team, that we're specifying an appropriate level of detail. Okay, so one thing that we need to make sure that we remember is that these IT professionals are highly trained professionals. We don't need to give them a requirement broken down into essentially a flowchart for each thing they're going to do. We can give them a high level requirement, we can provide them the context in which that requirement is needed and ask them to come up with appropriate options. So in many respects, the less we constrain the IT team, the more options we're going to get from that team and the more likely that we're actually going to get an option that meets the needs of the business and is actually helping to improve the operations. So again, it's one of those diversity things, right? The more people who are looking at the problem and thinking about the problem in different ways, the more likely you are to get a better solution. And if you try and specify at the business level too much detail in the requirement, you actually are counterproductive, right? Because you put too much information into the business requirement. The IT team will try and implement that, even if it's not the best IT solution to the problem that the business really needs solving. So one thing that you need to be really careful of when translating requirements is that you've got the appropriate level of detail to the audience that you're talking to. So this talks to this second thing, right? Is tell the IT team what you need and why you need it. So when you're looking at the level of detail, if they understand what you're trying to achieve, they may be able to see different ways of achieving the same thing, maybe reusing existing systems or repurposing something that already exists, or maybe looking at doing something a different way. Right, so don't try and prejudge the requirement. Make sure you tell them what they need, why you need it, and then let the IT team actually figure out what the options are so that the business can say, well, okay, based on what I told you, you've given me three options. Looking at those three options, either you didn't understand my requirement at all, go away and do it again, or you did understand my requirements at a deeper level, and option B is the most appropriate option. So that's what you're looking for, right? You want to make sure that you're giving requirements at an appropriate level to the IT team so they can generate effective options that you can then choose from and validate the fact that yes, they understood what you were asking for and that the solution that they're providing actually looks like a really good solution to your problem. The other thing that we need to be able to do here is be prepared to fail and try again. So we don't want to be in a situation where it's a one-shot deal. Either they get it right and we spend $1 million and it works, or what we would rather have is that there are lots of incremental small projects and requirements building towards a complete solution. So what we want to be looking for is opportunities to make small independent changes that we can easily deploy and roll back if they don't work. Right? We want fast turnaround time. We want low risk, low cost. Right? So when we come up with our small set of requirements, we can say, well, we need to implement these 10 things. Go away and implement them. And the IT team comes back and 7 out of 10 are good. And 2, not so good. Can you have another try at this, please? And then they can focus on those 2 plus another 8 things in the next iteration, in the next cycle of doing work. That's much more likely to lead to the business actually getting what they need and getting that need into implementation and production faster. So what we want to do is make sure that the business and IT have got that try and fail again mentality, that it doesn't matter. It's not the end of the world if we try something and it doesn't work first time. We can pick this up and we can do this again. So we're going to be talking again in detail as we go through the course and different techniques and ideas around how we can actually get to a point where we're translating requirements into solutions more accurately and we're doing it faster and we're doing it on this prepare to fail and try again methodology. Okay, so we had our requirements. We've translated our requirements into solutions. Now what we need to do at the end of the process is validate the solution against the requirements. Right? So there was no point saying I need it to do X if I build a solution that does Y. I need to make sure that my solution actually does X. So one thing that we need to make sure that we build into our process here is user acceptance testing. So somebody who on the business side, who is a user of the system, has to go through and validate that the requirements have actually been implemented in the solution. Now, ideally, again, in the olden days, when we built these big monolithic applications, if I made a change to any part of that application, UAT was test the whole thing because you couldn't be sure that the change that I made over here on this form didn't impact another form somewhere else in the application. So you had to test everything. With modern application architectures, as we're going to be discussing in this course, one of the important things to understand from user acceptance testing is determining the scope of what needs to be tested. So again, this is where the business and IT team are going to work together to say, well, okay, in terms of say building this application, if I structure it this way rather than that way, I can say that if I make a change to a function A or a field here in form A, that change is encapsulated to this smaller set of functionality. Not everything needs to be retested. So one thing that we want to do as part of the validation steps is understand both from a business and a technical perspective, what is it we're building, how are we building it, how can we minimize the scope of user acceptance testing that needs to be done every time we deploy a change, and what level of detailed testing is going to be required of the functionality as we implement it into the new production environment. A related thing that we need to take into account is this idea of regression testing. So as I said, when we had a big monolithic application, if I made a change to any part of the application, then I would have to regression test the whole application. So everything that could potentially have been changed as part of that build would need to be tested again. So one thing we need to do when we're building our business requirements and as we're building our solutions to implement those business requirements is understand the scope of regression testing so that we can essentially implement solutions that reduce the cost and risks associated with user acceptance and regression testing. And again, we're going to do some deep dive videos in terms of how we would actually structure our applications to be able to achieve these objectives. Okay, final slide in this introduction is we're going to talk very briefly about why the industry as a whole adopted the Agile approach. So if you were working in the industry before 2010 and the early 2000s and before, pretty much everything was developed using what we call a waterfall approach. So you went through requirements, you finished requirements, you did design, you finished the design, you did the implementation, you finished implementation, you did the testing, you did the integration testing, you did the acceptance testing, and then you deployed it. And it was largely a waterfall. You finish one phase and then you do the second and so on. So at the requirements phase, you might gather all of the business requirements, and then 2 years later, we've got an application that's ready for user acceptance test. So it could be a very expensive path to failure. And for many projects, it was exactly that. It was a path to fail. It used to take 2 or 3 years, and we get to a point where we're bringing the application back to the users, and the users are saying, well, that's what I said 2 years ago, but either you didn't understand or it's not what I need today. And the issue there is that you've now wasted a couple of years and a few $1 million, and the business still doesn't have what they need. So a lot of these waterfall-based approaches essentially have fallen by the wayside over the last 10, maybe 15 years as we start to see the adoption of what we described as the Agile Manifesto. So essentially the Agile approach is, again, it's not standard. There's no standard that you go to say this is the standard Agile approach. And to be honest, the results have been very mixed. So some organizations have moved to Agile and implemented it well. Many organizations have tried to implement Agile and it's just become an abbreviated form of waterfall. So one thing that we're going to be talking about when we look at the governance is we're going to be doing a very deep dive into governance of Agile projects and the key success factors required to make sure that your Agile project is actually executing the work correctly. As it relates to business architecture, we've identified a key takeaway list. So again, we're going to do a deep dive on Agile governance, and that will be its own separate lecture as a whole. So the key takeaways are, from a business perspective, keep it at high level, prioritize what you need as high level requirements, trust the IT team to work with you to take those prioritized requirements and turn them into actual application code that can then be deployed. And then remember, but the whole point is try and fail and try again, is that if you go through that process, it should be the case that errors in the requirements should be quickly identified and easy to correct. So if you basically fail to specify how a customer works correctly, then great, we implement the customer, we have a look at it, oh, it's not quite right, let's fix it. Right? Waterfall solution, you might have got that wrong, and it might be 2 years later when you actually find out that you made that mistake in the customer definition. So with Agile, the idea is, put it in place, try it out, does it work? If it doesn't work, what do you need to do to fix it? And that you do that over a short time frame, working very collaboratively, right the way from the business through to the implementation and operations team to make sure that everything is actually being specified correctly and that you have a good balance of correct requirements being delivered to IT in a sequence that makes sense to the business to deliver value to operations. We're going to be doing a whole bunch of deep dive videos in this course that talk to all of these aspects and how to make sure that you have correctly aligned the IT and the business around understanding what the business needs, why the business needs it, making sure that you have consent within the business around those priorities and those values, and making sure they're accurately communicated to your implementation teams so that your IT department can properly support that activity.
To learn more about Great Ideas products and solutions, visit greatideas.com. That's great ideas with a Z.com. Thanks.